Okay, so great. Thank you for joining. You are in the right place. If you want to know the answer to the question, what does a parliamentarian do? Okay, so we actually don't have a large group with us today, so we were just going to do a quick virtual circle. Wanted to just kind of do a check-in with people. But JP, do you have one or two specific things that you were hoping to learn about in the parliamentarian training?
I would just say that for our school, I'm an incoming VP at New Traditions, and it's a whole new board. And so, broadly speaking, it might just be helpful to understand or get any advice on how a new board might want to set up and manage the PTA and get the community involved.
Great. And so, that this is always happening, and it's a good thing, right? That people are cycling through PTA leadership, and we'd love to have new leaders. And some of our previous information from earlier today when we had an officer training would also be very helpful for how to run an effective meeting, but also just this whole parliamentary procedure that you may have heard of. That's also very much a part of helping to run an effective meeting. Is a great thing for anyone that's new to learn. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. So in terms of a parliamentarian, you can break it down into three main roles. The first role of a parliamentarian is really to be a consultant or an advisor to the president. They partner a lot with the president. So that's why it is an appointed role, is because you need to be able to work well with the president. The second main role of a parliamentarian is to chair the annual Bylaws Review Committee, and we'll talk more about the bylaws in a bit. And then the third part of being a parliamentarian is to help run the nominating committee. They really just start off the first meeting of the nominating committee. They don't necessarily need to be a part of that committee, but part of that role responsibility is to call the first meeting to order. And hi,
So,
Joanne, welcome. Go ahead.
is a parliamentarian an actual role on the board, or is it just somebody who helps orchestrate, as you described?
Good question. So in the bylaws, for everyone's bylaws, you'll see that the parliamentarian is a dedicated role that is appointed. So it's not ever part of the elections, the official elections. The parliamentarian is never elected. It's always an appointed role because, like I mentioned, you want that person to be able, the president would appoint it because they want it to be someone that they can really work well with and consult. Now, if you don't have a permanent parliamentarian, appointed and approved by the board for that whole year, you can always appoint a parliamentarian just for that meeting. And
And
so,
a
mhm.
and a parliamentarian could also be a board member.
Yeah, you could just have someone that's acting as a board member. They would, as the parliamentarian. So you wouldn't get two votes. So if you just needed to appoint, a VP to act in the role of parliamentarian to help with procedures in the meeting, then that person would still just get the one vote on the board.
And given, sometimes roles are difficult to fill, I suppose, um, is there a level of importance to this? Like, is it a required role in order to sort of motion and move things through, or is it more of a like this is a nice to have?
That's such a good question because I can't say that it's just a nice to have. You don't need to have the parliamentarian. Even on our second district board this whole term, we did not have an assigned parliamentarian. So that should answer the question that it's not required. There's actually three officers that are required. It's president, secretary, and treasurer. So if you have those three, you're minimum and good to go. But it is really important. It's a great role to fill for someone that is coming in new because it gives you a chance to learn about all of the procedures and how things work. It's also a great role for a previous president and a way to keep that previous president around and engaged. It's not like a huge amount of responsibility assigned to the parliamentarian, but it would be great, to have a previous president fill in that role. They're probably pretty familiar with how to make motions by that time, and with procedure. So it's a great role for a previous president also to fill. But so you can get by without it, but it is always a welcomed seat to be filled as a permanent role as well. Okay.
Hi, I just had a question. Sorry I'm late. My husband and I were on the same thing, and then we're in separate breakouts, so I was like, oh, I gotta log in. So anyway, for that
Welcome.
last box around the nominating committee's first meeting, when does that actually happen? Like in the year? Is it like early on? Is the nominating committee, sort of thinking through things as the year at the beginning of the year, or is it later in the year when, the nominating really starts happening?
Well, I love you make a good point that it is something that should always be top of mind because they are only 1-year terms, right? So as soon as you become, president, you should be thinking, at least in the back of your mind, like who could fill in, who's going to be the next president. But officially, nominating committees are elected by the membership, and that usually happens in January of the school year. But that's another question that's answered in your bylaws. Your bylaws say when to elect that nominating committee. And there is a bit of a timeline, and we'll go over that a little bit. So that's something to
Thanks.
always be keeping in mind. Okay. So as that first box showed, the first role is to assist the president to manage meetings and advise on parliamentary procedure. And so how would we get started with that? So you want to be familiar with your bylaws and the standing rules yourself as the parliamentarian, and we'll talk more about the difference between bylaws and standing rules in a moment. And this really goes for all officers. You want to talk with your outgoing parliamentarian to get some background ideas and tips. You want to know that California PTA has a lot of resources on its website about parliamentary basics, about the bylaws and the review process, about nominating committees. And because your role is so closely connected with the president, as I've mentioned, this is why parliamentarian is an appointed role by the president. So be sure to meet with the incoming president to talk about how you'll work together. And then you want to give a little training yourself, like not just this training like we're doing with you, but give a training to yourself to your incoming board members about the PTA bylaws. And you can create a summary of your bylaws to help them get through it, just like you saw earlier. And I'll show you again that you can create a summary of your bylaws. You can also give a brief training to your board and your membership about just basic parliamentary procedure, which we'll review in a moment. Review how to make a motion with people at your first meeting of the year. That can be a good idea. And so the next role is to advise and mentor PTA members on parliamentary procedure, like making motions and whether or not you have a quorum to vote. So do you know where to find what quorum is for your executive board meetings or your membership meetings? It's in your bylaws. It's pretty much always the answer. The answers are in there. So it's such a useful document. But so you can find the minimum number of people to conduct business in both types of meetings. And it's always a different number for each.
It's my summer homework to review the bylaws.
Very good. Okay, so some more about parliamentary procedure. It's just, what is parliamentary procedure? It sounds kind of fancy. It's really just a way to help conduct effective and efficient meetings. It allows for all the voices to be heard, but the majority to make decisions. By making motions, it really helps to keep order because when a motion is on the floor, you're really supposed to stick to that one topic. So as a parliamentarian, if someone starts, talking about something else, you can say, oh, remember there's a motion on the floor. You can advise the president to say so. So it really just helps with fairness and giving everyone an opportunity to contribute. And so making a motion, that is how we take action in a PTA meeting or in many types of meetings. There are actually professional parliamentarians. I did not know this until I went to a PTA convention, and they're actually, a paid job that people just get they get really geek out on this parliamentary procedure. It doesn't need to be like that, but I do recommend that you get really familiar and comfortable with the 8 steps to a motion. And I also like to break it down, and it's not, the 8 steps, that's a lot. I mean, the first step, let's just start with that, is, that you have to be recognized. So the chair or the president would recognize you. So we're already on to step 2. So the very first part of making a motion is to say, I move. So I like to use the example of, I move that chocolate ice cream should be served at every PTA meeting. So if that's something that only one person wants to talk about and there's no second to that, then you're not going to waste your time talking about that. But if someone says, I move that we have chocolate ice cream at every meeting, and then someone seconds the motion, that means at least 2 people in the room want to talk about this, and that's enough to move on. So let's see, the next step would be that the chairperson always just make it really clear for everyone. So I move, I want chocolate ice cream. Second, the chairperson would say the motion on the floor is that we serve chocolate ice cream at every PTA meeting. That's when you get to discuss and debate. You want to pay attention as a parliamentarian to things like, are you giving too much time to the people talking in favor of the motion, too much time you want to keep that equal in favor and opposed. Sometimes this gets to be a really big deal. If you're talking about a really hot, contentious topic, you might have a whole long line of people that want to speak to the motion. You can do something like take a list of names and write them down in order. You can remind people if someone's already made your point, please be respectful, and you don't need to repeat the exact same point, offer something different. But you're still just sticking to the fact, are we serving ice cream at every meeting? There is a way, if the conversation is going on for a long time, for you to say, I want to move to the question, or I move to the vote. And so then the chairperson would need to say, okay, we're moving on to actually doing the vote. So all those in favor say aye, and you wait and see all of those that say they are supportive. And then you always need to ask all those opposed. So don't forget, sometimes we forget because a lot of things are unanimously yes often, but not always. And I think it's great when there's someone in opposition. We don't all need to agree on the same things. So always remember to ask for that no. And then the chairperson again reiterates that the motion passes and to say what that is. And all of that is recorded in the meeting. So that's just a very detailed, long way to get through the 8 steps of a motion. And we can practice that at the end if you want to give it a try. So the next role that we're going to cover that I mentioned is a part of the parliamentarian's responsibilities is to chair the bylaws committee and to review those unit bylaws each year and revise every 5 years. And so it used to be that you had to revise every 3 years, I think it was. And so they've extended it, which is a little bit nice. So if you don't have a lot of changes, you don't need to update those, but every 5 years. I will say a lot of updates happened recently in the pandemic. For example, they added in the latest version to have conferencing meetings allowed for all types of meetings, all board meetings, all association meetings. So that was really good to just have that there in writing. It counted for everyone's, even if your bylaws didn't say that. But so there's always new versions coming out. So I do recommend, if possible, updating it more than every 5 years, but it's only necessary every 5 years. But what is necessary is that you at least review them each year. A committee can simply be 2 people, so yourself as a parliamentarian and one other person. It can be more if you like, and they'll just read through the bylaws and talk about if you have any recommendations for updating, and then we'd go through that process. So here's just a look at the table of contents of the bylaws. The formal language can be difficult for some people to understand, so you can also provide that summary that I mentioned and just bullet point the main points. So here's the example summary that we showed earlier in our meeting today of our 2nd district bylaws. You can see that it has the actual legal name there. It will have the organization date, which is always interesting. Some are very old. You might not know how old your PTA, how long it's been there in existence. Has certain things like ID numbers that you'll often need to access the leadership website. You'll need that California ID number on the front of your bylaws. It lists who are your officers. Some bylaws will only have the basics, the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. It will always list the appointed officer of a parliamentarian. It talks about the nominating committee. Most are 3 or 5 members, usually a odd number. And it tells you when you're doing your meetings. And that goes for both board meetings and association meetings. It tells you about your all-important quorums. How many people do you need to run a board meeting, to run an association meeting? And you may have heard me refer to standing rules. Those are usually the last 2 pages of bylaws. And the differences are outlined here. So the bylaws are more a big picture, and the standing rules are more the specifics about your unit. So whereas the bylaws may give the primary responsibilities for officers and chair people, the standing rules give some of the specific responsibilities. You can add in anything you want into the standing rules. There's also a big difference in the process for updating. So bylaws can be a little bit longer, involved process. And standing rules are something that you can change at every single association meeting if you needed to or wanted to. If you don't tell people in advance that you're going to make a change to the standing rules, it would require a 2/3 majority vote. But if it's something you've planned ahead and have announced, it just requires a simple majority vote for that. Any questions about the difference between bylaws and standing rules? Okay.
Yes, sorry. So the standing rules are specific to changes that were made to the bylaws?
No, it doesn't list changes. It's more specific details that might only apply to your PTA. Whereas in the bylaws section, that's going to be really standard language that there's not a whole lot that you can change in there. That it applies to like all of our PTAs in California. But the standing rules might be where you put something like, we require that any reimbursements that you want submitted are submitted to the treasurer by, the end of May. That's not something we're going to, regulate for all PTAs, but that's how well your PTA wants to make a, statement about that, add it in your standing rules.
Got it. And to repeat, the standing rules are found where? Within the bylaws?
Yeah, it's like the last 2 pages. So when you we'll talk about, how you actually go about making updates, but it's electronic. The easiest way is the e-bylaws, and it will automatically be those last 2 pages of the packet.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
And those can be changed easier than obviously the bylaws, right?
That's exactly right. Okay. Yep. So bylaws take a little more process, a little more time to make changes because they go through the district and then through the California Parliamentarian. It takes some time for them, and they've got bylaws from all across California to approve. And so it can take anywhere from, at a not busy time, the beginning of the school year, there's a lot more going on. So that could take, hopefully not up to 2 months. I'd say on average, it's about 3 weeks to get them around, but sometimes earlier. And those standing rules, like you said, every meeting you could. That doesn't really happen, but just know that they're very flexible. Okay, so how do we update the bylaws? It starts with that committee. So you and at least one other person can share the committee just simply to review them. If you come up with a detailed list of changes or amendments, you would present that first to your board, and your board actually votes to approve those changes that you would like. Then you will submit them to us at 2nd District PTA, and we get the approval of the parliamentarian. They come back, signed by that parliamentarian, and then we give them back to you. So feels almost a little bit sort of backwards, because it's at that point then that you bring it to get adopted, final approval from your membership. So you start as a small committee review, you run it past your board, they give you any input, they usually sign off, and then you get the signature approval from the state PTA, and then it comes back and your membership adopts it. So I just ran through that just very quickly, but it's on these slides here for you to refer to later. A good point is that make sure that the bylaws are accessible. Any member that asks for it, you can freely hand it out. There's nothing secretive or private about bylaws. And the president, secretary, and parliamentarian should definitely always have a copy available at meetings to refer to. Okay, and then that third main responsibility of a parliamentarian is to arrange for the nominating committee's first meeting and to provide information for that nomination and election process. So what is a nominating committee? It is the only committee that is elected by your membership, because most committees are appointed by the president. It is the committee that helps to recruit and create a slate of nominees to fill any of the officer roles that are defined in your bylaws. So it's like the recruiters. So when to elect and how many, that you had that question, Joanne. So it's usually no later than January. And it's always going to be, so most PTAs have elections either in March or April. So if it's March, your election for your nominating committee is going to be January. And it still could be January, even if your election is in April, but you do want to have at least 2 months. And why do you want to have at least 2 months? It's because you need at least 1 month in order to announce who is on your slate of nominees. So you need that another cushion. But like the good point that you made is this is something to always be thinking about. Who can I be inviting into leadership? So let's see, important point to make is that the president never serves on the committee. The president is in fact a de facto member of every committee in your PTA except this one. And that's because the nominating committee really has a lot of influence on your PTA, and you don't want just this person, that the president, the head of the PTA to, be having a say in the future and every single thing. So that's just the one committee that the president stays out of. The parliamentarian, a lot of people have the question, should the parliamentarian be a part of the nominating committee? They can be an elected member, but they are not automatically a member. Who is an automatic member is the principal. They can be an elected person on your nominating committee, but they always are at least an advisory person to the nominating committee. So the principal of the school should be somewhat involved or consulted on with that. So the parliamentarian brings together that first meeting. The first meeting of the nominating committee is just the time when you're explaining what their role is and giving them some tips on how to go about it. And there's tons of information about that on capta.org, capta.org. This committee is a definite period of time, so that's always good to know that this isn't something that runs, beyond the election. Once the election is over, the role of the nominating committee members is done. And use the bylaws to see, of course, you have to know which roles you're recruiting for, so you want to be really familiar with those bylaws. So here are some good qualities to have in your nominating committee members. You want to make sure that they're willing to devote the time that's needed to do the recruiting. You want to look for potential leaders that are representative of your student body and of your greater community at large. You want to make sure that people aren't just, recruiting their own friends, that they are very aware of the eligibility requirements, the qualifications. You want to make sure that they can hold in confidence discussions, because sometimes people will come to you, hey, I see that you're thinking about this person, and they tell you something very personal about that person. You just want to make sure that they're someone that is respectful of confidentiality as well. So then there is a timeline. let's see, so once elected, you, as a nominating committee, you will meet to make sure you understand your role, you review the requirements, and make a plan for how to create that slate of nominees. So say you only have a president, a secretary, a treasurer, and one vice president. So that one vice president is the one role that is not required. Even if you can't find say the secretary that is required, you still would go ahead and report that slate of nominees 28 days in advance of the election meeting. Even if it's blank, you would just report, we have no names to fill in, but that's the responsibility of the nominating committee, is to report 28 days in advance of the election. If you have a change in that slate, either an addition or even a change altogether, maybe someone is now leaving the school, doesn't want to do that role anymore, or can't fulfill it, whatever the reason, you can change that slate right up until the election. At the election, you just present a revised slate. So in terms of resources where you can find more information about the parliamentarian responsibilities, you always want to check on the toolkit that can be found at californiapta.org, capta.org. It has things like an actual job description. It has that for all of the officers. There's links to those 8 steps to a motion. There's this little bit more involved or advanced motions chart. Now this, I have never seen a local school PTA use all of these types of things, but they can be fun for some people to review. There's a motions chart. This page here, so when you start to do, just practically, when you start to update bylaws or just want to bring it to the most current version, you start off with e-bylaws by going to this page. You'll start off by requesting a username and password. Takes a couple days. There's a volunteer on the other end of that link that will give you access. And it's the easiest way because it basically is a like a survey, and we'll ask you, when do you want your meeting dates? What are your committees? Which officers do you want? And it'll help you calculate the quorums that are available to you as well. And it spits out a PDF version of your bylaws, and that's what you will submit to us via email. So it used to be, before the pandemic, that you had to make multiple copies and send it through the US mail. Unfortunately, there are some places on this website that still refer to that. Just know that you do not need to do anything with paper copies. It's all sent in via email to us. So that is a good thing that came out of the pandemic. Let's see, and there's more information about all the responsibilities, including the nominating committee, lots about that. This one here is kind of a fun thing you could bring, if I talked about maybe hold a little mini training for your board or your membership too. And you could go through some of these, true and false quiz, and it has very detailed answers for you as well. So I'll stop here because that was a lot of information about the 3 main roles of the parliamentarian, and just happy to answer any more specific questions that have come up for you, if any.
I don't have any specific questions yet, but I'm sure I will as I work through all of this. I mean, I've been involved in PTAs, but more on the committee side of things. And so this is my first, what I would call a real role. But yeah, I need to do some reviewing, I think, before I start formulating more specific questions.
Well, welcome to PTA board, and and all of it is real, right? Because there's so much that goes on, like you
totally
said, behind scenes, that
completely.
It's all a village that help to pull it off.
I do have a question, and just to confirm, so every year the PTA board is re-elected, and this parliamentary person, one of the key roles among others is ensuring that there's a nominating committee to nominate and get parents involved to potentially run for the board. And then you said something about March and April. What are the key time frames for creating that nominating committee, and when is typically again the annual PTA election?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, it's a new board every year. I also wanted to add that if you should any individual would only be serving in that same exact role 2 times in a row. So for example, if you're president one year, you would need to, it's not automatic that you would be president a second year. You need to be elected a second year, and that's fine to do consecutively for 2 years. But that third year, it's kind of like a chance for someone else to be in that role. But that doesn't mean that same person couldn't be in that role, after taking a break. I wanted to mention that. And then in terms of the timeline part of the question, nominating committee will be specified the election for that in your bylaws. So your bylaws probably say January. And so for the agenda for your January or might be February meeting, you would want to have, it's usually three to five members lined up that your membership would vote to approve. So those, say, 3 people would be your official nominating committee members after they're elected. And then it takes about 2 months of a timeline. So in January, they're elected, and in March would be your election meeting. So again, it's your bylaws that already state if your annual election is in March or April. They will always be before the second week in April. And the reason for that is that they want to give you time for transition towards the end, to have some overlap between the incoming people and the outgoing, as well as an opportunity for those new people to join the PTA convention, which is in April. So they want those new people to be able to, benefit from attending convention, which is just a ton of more information and learning opportunities. So again, it's usually January is the election of the nominating committee. They're doing their work. They're announcing who they've found in February, and then the election in March. It might just be pushed 1 month later than that.
Got it. Very clear. Thank you.
Okay, good. And it's just so much information that's been presented today. So that it may just like all go out of one's head as well. So but just remember, that California, the capta.org, just Google whatever it is you're looking for on there, and a lot of information will come up. Sometimes it's almost too much information to sort through. I'm really familiar with that website. So the other thing is, just don't hesitate to reach out to Second District PTA. That's a great thing about being part of the PTA and not your own independent PTO. You are a part of this organization. So you've got your district to support you, and you've got your state to support you, and even nationally. So there's a lot of support out there. So really don't hesitate. And we really do plan to be able to connect with each of you throughout the school year and reach out. But if you haven't heard from us by the beginning of the school year, please don't hesitate to email, set up a phone call.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.
Really helpful information. So even just this 30 minutes, I learned way more about what I need to do.
That's awesome.